Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Today I'm not going to speak about this area of research that you mentioned, that is Patanjali Yoga, but I'm going to talk about my research in Ayurveda, which I conducted in the context of a series of consecutive research projects at the University of Vienna that were led by Professor Karen Preisendans and her team, which aimed upon establishing a critical edition of the Charaka Samhita Vimanasthana 8. And today I want to highlight a certain aspect that came up in the course of this project, namely the aspect of the importance that manuscript studies have not only for philologists, but also the importance of manuscript studies for modern Ayurveda. And in order to do so, I would like to remember or remind ourselves that, of course, also modern Ayurveda is to a large extent based upon the knowledge that was codified in the ancient Samhitas, as for example the Charaka Samhita, on which I'm going to speak today. So the Charaka Samhita, as is well known from the text itself, has a long and complicated textual history. We all know that the Charaka Samhita originally was derived from an earlier work called Agnivesha Tantra, about virtually nothing is known, and that it was this Agnivesha Tantra was then revised by somebody called Charaka, who created the Charaka Samhita, and that the Charaka Samhita was at a later point in history, maybe in the 6th century of the Common Era, found to be incomplete by a reductor called Dhritabala. And Dhritabala then made the Charaka Samhita complete by composing a couple of chapters himself and by revising the rest of the text. What exactly Dhritabala has done and which chapters he exactly composed is, however, largely unknown. What I want to focus upon is not actually the question of how Dhritabala changed the Charaka Samhita, but the question of how then the Charaka Samhita developed after Dhritabala had prepared his revision of the work. The problem that we are facing here is basically a problem of information retrieval. We have a work that was composed in the 6th century of the Common Era, and we want to know how this book looked like at this time, and which is the approach that we can take in order to bridge this huge gap of more than 1400 years before the time of the composition of the final revision and nowadays. And of course, the easiest approach that one may take is to go to a shelf and fetch a book, a printed edition of the Charaka Samhita, like the one that you're seeing here on screen. More exactly, you'll see the title page of a very famous printed edition of the Charaka Samhita, which was prepared by Yadavji Trikamji Acharya. It's the 3rd edition that Trikamji Acharya published in 1941. So there we have the text very neatly set in bold of the Charaka Samhita, and underneath we have the text of the commentary by Chakrapanidatta. The question, of course, remains, where did Trikamji have his text from? How did he bridge this large gap in time that I had referred to earlier? And in which relationship does this printed edition stand to earlier printed editions of the Charaka Samhita? Like, for example, the printed edition that we have prepared by Gangadhara Kaviraj, which was published in 1878 or 1879 and was printed in Bengali characters, as you see here on the screen, the beginning of the Charaka Samhita Vimanasthana. And in fact, these are not the only printed editions that we have. There is a huge range of printed editions, and they all have slightly different text. So here is a list of some of the printed editions, by far not all, and together with the place of publication and the date at which they were published. And three of them are marked in colors. The one in green is the one by Yadavji Trikamji, and there are two others. First of all, the one in blue, published by Jivananda Vidyasagara Bhattacharya in 1877, and the other one that you saw just immediately before by Gangadhara Kaviraj. And as we found out in the course of our studies, the edition that Yadavji Trikamji published is in fact a mixture of the two text versions that we find in the Vidyasagara edition and in the Gangadhara edition, without any explanation of how and why Yadavji Trikamji decided to edit the one or the other version. In fact, these very early versions that we see here, the one by Vidyasagara and the one by Gangadhara, are based on other sources of information than printed edition, because earlier printed editions did not exist. What existed, however, were manuscripts. And this is, of course, the very obvious reply to my earlier question of how the information that was encoded by Dridabala in his final revision made it to the present day or into the printed editions that we are now having available. So the Charaka Samhita was copied and recopied. And in the course of preparing copies of earlier copies, the text changed slightly and to various degrees, which means that the versions that we have nowadays are not necessarily the version that Dridabala composed himself. This is due to the fact that none of the surviving manuscripts that we have goes back to the time when Dridabala lived. As is well known, manuscripts under the climatic conditions of South Asia do not survive for a very long time. Usually 300 to 400 years could be regarded as a maximum time span in which manuscripts survive. After this, they get brittle, they get lost, they crumble into dust, or they are eaten by rats or worms. So in order to keep the transmission of knowledge alive, manuscripts need to be copied and recopied. And during this process, the knowledge on the one hand is transmitted, but on the other hand, of course, slight variations in the text creep in. The oldest manuscript that we have of the Charaka Samhita, the oldest surviving manuscript is the oldest dated surviving manuscript, one has to say, is the manuscript from Alipur, which has the siglum AP1, preserved at the Bogilal Laherchand Institute of Indology. So this manuscript was copied in 1571 or 72, which is quite early, but still 900 years or 1,000 years later than the time when Dridabala created his final revision of the Charaka Samhita. So what has happened in between? Now that's the question to deal with, and how can we reach an early version of the Charaka Samhita? And why is it meaningful and useful to do so for gaining knowledge of the cultural history of early South Asia, and specifically in the present context of the pharmacology, for example, of early Ayurveda? These are the questions that I'm going to address in the next part of my presentation. So first of all, I want to show you a slide containing root structure or a net structure which displays the relationship of the different manuscripts, witnesses that we have for the Charaka Samhita Vimana Sthana 8. These are 52 manuscripts that have been, the variants of which have been recorded for a considerable amount of text, basically for the whole of the Vimana Sthana 8, which is approximately half of the text of the Vimana Sthana. And this data have been fed into a software that was developed for evolutionary biology, software called PORB. This is a phylogenetic analysis using parsimony, which is the criterion on which the relationships, the genealogical relationships of the different witnesses are established. And what we see here in the slide is that the witness I introduced earlier, the oldest version of the text that we have in a manuscript, our Alipur 1 manuscript, is located here, very much to the right hand of the tree, and it is genealogical closely related to another manuscript here from Varanasi. These are the two manuscripts that Gangadhara used to prepare his edition of the Charaka Samhita. Here we have the manuscript that was used by Jivananda Vidyasagara when he produced his early edition of the Charaka Samhita. So we see that very few branches of the transmission are actually covered by what we find in the printed edition. So this unrooted tree, which basically shows the structure of the transmission of the Charaka Samhita in the various manuscripts that we have, can be turned into a representation of the transmission history by introducing the top of this net structure, which is called the root. And I've indicated the position at which marks the top of the historical development, the root, here with this blue circle. If we look at the same structure turned into a tree, and we are reducing all the manuscripts that turn out to be genealogically not very meaningful, that is, which do not help to establish as the original version of the text, it is possible to determine 10 manuscripts which, so to say, represent the backbone of the transmission history. We have 4 manuscripts that can go back to the reconstructed witness K. This is the oldest common ancestor of these 4 manuscripts, which belong to the Kashmiri branch of the transmission. We have here the Q branch of the transmission, in which the manuscript from Alipur figures. We have here a branch going back to a reconstructed witness, which is called S, and we have here 2 manuscripts from stemming from a witness called R. All these manuscripts on the right-hand side go back to the reconstructed witness E, and all the witnesses on the left-hand side go back to the K witness, the oldest ancestor of the Kashmiri branch. I now want to turn to a concrete example of how this theoretical knowledge of the transmission history of the Charaka Samhita can be used to reconstruct the oldest version, the version that Dridabala prepared in his revision of the text. And in doing so, I'm referring to a textual example from the Charaka Samhita that I would like to discuss in a little detail. And this passage is a pharmacological passage where medicinal substances are mentioned, and I will introduce the context in a little bit more detail later. So this is a compound which in the edition of Trikanji lists a couple of medicinal substances. Chitraka, Somavalka, and Shatavari. Shatavari, this is wild asparagus. Chitraka is lead word, and Somavalka is bayberry. These are the common identification of these substances. And now, if we look at the variants, we can see that Chitraka is transmitted here at this initial position by the reconstructed witnesses Q, R, and S, which, as we have seen previously, all figure on the right-hand side. Whereas those that figure on the left-hand side of this genealogical tree have transposed the position of Chitraka to a different position in the text, namely at the instance where Shatavari occurs in the other versions. Then we have Somavalka, transmitted in Q, R, and S. Again, here at the right-hand side of the stemma. And then we have manuscripts from K, which read a different text at this occasion. And finally, we have Shatavari at the end of the compound, which is replaced by Chitraka in K, and it is omitted in a number of different versions. So if we now draw upon the evidence of these of the different versions, it's possible to reconstruct the critically edited text as we have it here, which reads Somavalka Chitraka without Shatavari. So this is a quite important finding, I would say, namely that at this instance of in this list of medicinal substances, originally Shatavari did not occur and was later on added to this list for reasons that we will see later on in the course of this presentation. So in order to capture the varieties that we find in the different witnesses of manuscripts of the Charaka Samhita for the medicinal substances, we prepared a materia medica which lists all the medicinal substances in the 52 text versions of the Charaka Samhita Vimanasthana 8. And there we see, first of all, the items that we just discussed and will discuss in the further course of this talk, namely Chitraka, together with a couple of identifications. And we see that we have quite a number of variants in the manuscripts, namely we find Chitraka, Trika, Chitra, and Chitranka in some manuscripts for the term Chitraka. Similarly, for Dvipishatru, which is wild asparagus or Aspargus racemosus, we find at some instances Dvipi, Dvipakashatru, Dvipishatru, Dvipi, or Dvipi. Shatavari, for example, which is also wild asparagus, occurs as with the variants Gatavari, Shatavadi, Shatavadri, Shatashari, and Shigru, for example, occurring in 2 instances of the Charaka Samhita Vimanasthana 8, occurs as Shigra, Shigru, Segru, Sigru, Shigu, and Shirisha, and finally Somavalka, appearing at 2 instances and in 1 instance as a variant to Somavali, occurs with the variants Somavalkala, Shomavalka, Yomavalka, Somaka, Somavalkaka, Somakalka, Somakalva, Somakalka, Somavalka, and Somavaska. So it's quite obvious that, this demonstrates very clearly that identical medicinal substances occur under a large variety of names within the Charaka Samhita, and possibly that different medicinal substances may have the same name within the Charaka Samhita as well. So if we now look at the passage of the Charaka Samhita Vimanasthana 8.135, at which the passage that I have been discussing right now actually occurs, we see that the text reads, Yanu tu kalu vamanadishu peshaja dravyani upayogam gachanti tani anuvyakyasante. That means here medicinal substances, the peshaja dravyani, that are used upayogam gachanti in the treatment of vamana and so on, they are listed as follow. And then we have a long list. And you see that many of these items occur here in the critical edition with wavy underlines, which means that their reconstruction is not entirely certain, but different reconstructions are possible. We can, of course, not focus in the little time that we have upon the whole range of variants, but we want to stick to the one example that I introduced before, namely the reconstruction of Somavalka and Chitraka within this list. So then we have two different options. The one is Somavalkaka, Chitraka by K, and the other one is Chitraka, Somavalka by E. Yeah, these are the two readings that we have on both sides here of the stemma, one going back to K and one going back to E. That means the difference between the two versions must have occurred somewhere down the tree, either on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side. It is, however, possible that the reading Soma Valkaka Chitraka in K is basically just a small scribal error in which the final syllable of Soma Valka was written twice. And accordingly, the correct reading would be Soma Valka Chitraka, like we find it more or less by chance or by the ingenuity of the scribe, of this witness, in the manuscript MK, written in Kannada script, which stems from Mysore. So the question, of course, is what is the case with Shatavari, which we had seen in the edition of Trikamji as appearing at this instance. Where has it disappeared? What are actually the evidences for Shatavari? And here we see that Shatavari occurs exclusively within in a group of manuscripts that are all derived from the reconstructed witness Q. That means Shatavari was introduced only very late in the transmission history, namely on the way down here from Q down to AP1 and other manuscripts that have been excluded from this display in order to make it more, to make it simpler. So what we find in Trikamji's edition is that Trikamji accepted Gangadhara Kaviraj's edition as being authoritative without having any knowledge about the textual transmission of the work, and edit Shatavari into this into his text in order probably to construe a text that was as complete as possible. The whole situation is, of course, a little bit difficult, because Shatavari is the same medicinal substance as Dvipishatru, namely wild Aspergillus or Aspergillus racemosus. And yeah, we have Dvipishatru here in this version going back to the Kashmiri tradition. And we have here, on the other side, Dvipi Shigru as an alternative reading. So it's not entirely clear what has happened here, but if we reconstruct the text on the basis of what we know about the transmission history, it's quite probable that originally here Somavalka and Chitraka followed by Dvipi Shatru is the correct reading, and that neither Dvipi Shigru nor Shatavari, as we find it in the edition of Trikamji, were originally part of the text. So this is this one example that I'm now discussing here very briefly is, of course, just a single one, a single example from hundreds and thousands of instances where it is possible to come back to a much earlier version of the Charaka Samhita, a much earlier version which can be established with good philological arguments to come much closer to the original that Dridabala composed or revised than any other version that we have in the printed editions or in the manuscripts. One of the proofs, if any such proof is needed, for the fact that the version that we reconstruct is quite early can be seen from the fact that if we take a look at the version that is commented upon in commentaries, especially upon in the commentary by Chakrapanidata, which is the oldest and the only preserving commentary for this part of the Charaka Samhita, then we see that Chakrapanidata comments upon the version that was current in Bengal, in our Q group. And since we know that Chakrapanidata was active at the court of Bengal, it's quite clear, that our reconstruction is correct, is historically valid, that we can determine the version that Chakrapanidata was commenting upon, and we can also determine a much earlier version which comes quite close to the version that Dridabala composed. And I think it's absolutely necessary to do this work in order to increase our knowledge of what the ancient Samhitas of Ayurveda actually looked like. Thank you very much for your attention.